All right, am I live? Sounds like I am. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right, I see some thumbs up. It's hard to see you with the lights in my eyes, but I can see sufficiently. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. This is the after lunch session, and the official speaker's handbook says, according to section 12, subsection 42, every speaker in this time slot has to make a witty remark about stay awake after your bellies are full. So consider that done. All right, thank you for coming. How's the conference so far? All right, a little above tepid. That's okay, that's great. All right, it's going to get greater after this session. Thank you for coming. This is Word Smatter, exploring semantics, testers, and problems. Anybody ever heard the word smatter? Care to raise your hand, tell me what does smatter mean? Anybody know the definition of smatter? Smattering, a smattering of something. Anyway? Right there, I see a hand.
Like a small, random sample.
Exactly, yeah, a small superficial amount of something. Well, today it's going to be a smattering of words. I'm going to use words to talk about words, and we're going to talk specifically about exploring semantics and what that means, relate that to testers, and look at the problems that we face as testers. How many testers do we have in the audience? Show of hands. Okay, several hands, and it doesn't matter because this will apply to people that are in testing, that's your career, that's what you do for a living, but it will also be very applicable to those people that work with testers. And for any of you that don't work with testers and are not a tester, the first half, the semantics part, will be applicable to you as a human being. It's all about semantics and understanding, so hopefully everyone here gets something out of it. How many people read the abstract, by the way? Not every hand. All right, so I'm so curious why you're here, so I'll get to that in a second. All right, first, a little bit about me, build some trust here. My name's Damian Synadinos, Columbus, Ohio native, born and raised here. I started my software testing career at 19. I dropped out of the Ohio State University, and I started working at CompuServe. I worked in their quality assurance, I started working at CompuServe in their quality assurance department. I was there for about 4 years, and over the next 25 years, I worked at a variety of different software companies and non-software companies in quality assurance and testing. After that, I became a speaker. In 2014, I began speaking. In 2016, I founded my company, Ineffable Solutions, and became a full-time public speaker. This is what I do now on soft skills. That's my topics and focus. On the side, I also do artwork, and I also substitute teach at elementary schools. Many of those things involve semantic conversations, asking, what do you mean? Seeking understanding. I have to be very careful as a substitute teacher while I'm talking to kids K through 5 when they're constantly asking, Mr. S, what do you mean? What do you mean? So I have to describe, and sometimes I ask them, what do you mean? And we have to come to some understanding. So words are very important. Another thing is, as a tester, I oftentimes have to choose the right words when I'm reporting a bug to a developer or to an executive. I have to make sure that I'm using the right words to get the thing that's in my head into your head. And as a speaker, of course, I'm up here speaking, so words are very important. So I'm a student of words my entire life. I've been studying them, and I love them. So the things I'm going to talk about today, I'm not here as an expert or a preacher. I'm not here to tell you the way it's done. What I'm here to do today is tell you things that I've found in my personal experience that have worked for me, I've found valuable over the years. And hopefully, if your context is similar enough to my own, then maybe you'll find them valuable as well. Okay, so the agenda, we're going to talk about purpose and expectations. I like to start with the why. Simon Sinek kind of made that popular. But if you know why you're doing something, it helps you better understand what and how to do it. After that, we'll get into the two main parts, a smattering of semantics. The first half will be talking about semantics and understanding. And then the second half, we're going to use everything we learned in the first half and apply it to the second as we explore, deconstruct a phrase that has to do with testers and problems. So what? Who cares? This is the why part. So what? Why does this matter? Well, here's one suggestion. Primer on semantics. Maybe you have a vague understanding of semantics. You have a kind of an idea of what semantics is, but you want to learn more. Or maybe you know a lot about semantics and you're interested to hear another viewpoint about semantics. Maybe that's why you're here. Maybe you're here to get new or practical insight on the tester's role and responsibilities. Maybe you are a tester. Maybe you work with them, but you're not quite sure what they do. Well, hopefully I'll give you some insight into the things that testers do and who they are. But more importantly, words matter. Words are very, very important. Words influence our feelings, the way that we interact with each other. They influence our laws and our policies. Obviously, our feelings, I said that, it's so important. Words influence every single part of our lives. But I'm curious, again, I asked, why are you here? I'd like to see some answers to why you chose this session. There's a lot of stiff competition in this time slot, and this is a wonderful conference, but I'm curious, why did you decide to come to this session today? Because words matter, all right. Cool, right, it's right there on the slide. Good. Anybody else? I saw a hand right there.
I'm a BA, so I do a lot of documentation, so
Words matter as a BA constantly. All right, taking the customer's expectations, their wants, needs, expectations, putting them into some type of requirement or something that can be read and used by other people down the line. Absolutely, words are important to that. Anybody else? Yes?
I often send out communications to our end users about the work our developers are doing, and I want to word them in a manner that will be understandable by the end users, not what the developers are sending me with. I created a flow, and this kind of thing.
So as a communicator to many different audiences, you have to make sure. Horrible reason. Next. No, I'm just joking. Of course, that's very, very important. As someone communicates with a wide, diverse audience of people, you might have to form messages in different ways to speak to them. Great reason. Thank you. Anybody else? Way over there. Yes. Oh, that's a good one. Writing and reading user stories unambiguously. Anybody ever run into an ambiguous or vague requirement or user story? Of course not, right? Okay, there's a lot of hands. Sure, of course, that's very important, that words matter when you're creating user stories and requirements, whatever format they happen to take. Anybody else want to share? All right, so we have some great reasons why you're here. Hopefully, as we proceed through, some of you will, even if you didn't speak up, you'll find that hopefully I cover some of the reasons that you're here today. So, anybody ever heard this phrase or even said this phrase? It's just semantics. I've heard it many times in my life. I've even said it quite a few times. Oftentimes in the middle of a debate or discussion, someone will say, oh, well, it's just semantics, Damian. So what are they actually meaning by this? In my experience, it means a couple different things. Sometimes they mean it's just a difference of words. So I'm talking with someone, we're discussing something, and they say, it's just semantics. You're saying and I'm saying the same thing as you are. We're just using different words to express the exact same idea. Damian, it's just a difference of words. Sometimes it means something a little deeper. Sometimes they mean it's merely a minor difference. That not only are our words different, but your message is slightly different than my message. Your idea is different than mine. So there's a minor difference in our ideas, and it's a semantic difference. Sometimes they might mean it's a fundamental difference. Sometimes you're discussing something with someone and they say, man, it's just semantics. It's just semantics, Damian. They mean that there's a major shift. Your railroad tracks are not meeting with theirs, and there's going to be major problems unless you figure out what's going on. But in my experience, most oftentimes when I'm discussing or debating or arguing with someone and I hear this phrase, it's just semantics, here's usually what they mean. Shut up, the conversation's over. Very oftentimes in my experience, it's just semantics is used as a bullying technique. It's used to shut down a conversation, to stop the discussion. They don't want to talk about this anymore. For whatever reason there might be, they want to stop the conversation. So I'm curious about the word semantics. I'm a word lover, and I decided to look it up. Semantics comes from the Greek word semantikos, and semantikos in Greek, I'm Greek, means significant. And I think it's significant that the origin of the word semantics comes from the word significant. I think that's very interesting and important. So semantics, a dictionary definition, there's different definitions depending on which dictionary and source you look at. A dictionary definition is the meaning of a word, phrase, sentence, or text. Well, as a word lover, I realized when I saw this definition, I'd seen something like this before. And sure enough, if you look up the definition of definition, it's very similar. A definition of definition is a statement of the exact meaning of a word. Well, that's pretty similar to the meaning of a word, phrase, sentence, or text. But there's also another word that means something very similar. That word is meaning. Meaning is what is meant by a word, a concept, or action. So all three of these words are relatively synonymous with each other. They can be used to mean roughly the same thing. So taken literally, if somebody says it's just semantics, maybe they mean it's just definitions or it's just meaning. Well, think about that. If I'm talking with someone and we're disagreeing, and I'm arguing with them and they're arguing back and we're trying to come to some consensus and they say, it's just semantics, and I take that literally, what they're saying is, Damian, it's just definitions, it's just meaning, and I might stop and say, well, that seems pretty important, that seems pretty significant. I agree, it is semantics, and we need to come to some type of understanding, and we can use semantic conversations to come to that understanding. So, semantic conversations start when you're very, very young. I have young children, and I am constantly having semantic discussions with them. Sometimes they're fun. I say to my kids, oh, you're so adorable, I love you so much. And they go, oh, Daddy, what do you mean? What do you mean is the initiation of a semantic conversation. Sometimes it's more frustrating. Hey, kids, it's time for bed. And they say, what do you mean? I say, you know what I mean. Hey, come on, it's time for bed. That's a semantic discussion. Sometimes it doesn't even make sense. Daddy, when is the banana? I say, okay, what do you mean by that? Those are all initiations of a semantic discussion. And some people will say, well, that only happens with kids constantly asking that. But I would say that it happens all the way through adulthood, too. Anytime you talk to someone and they ask for understanding and they say, what do you mean by that? That's the initiation of a semantic discussion. Sometimes I'll speak with folks and I say, you know, one of my talks is all about semantics and linguistics and understanding meaning. And they go, I don't care about that stuff. It's not very important. And I say, well, what do you mean? As soon as they answer, I've tricked them into having a semantic discussion. Semantics is just about understanding. It's about seeking understanding and connection with meaning. So whether you like it or dislike it, whether you understand it or don't understand it, we are constantly having semantic discussions our entire lives. This talk, and what I'm going to talk about today, is making it more explicit so you can recognize when those semantic discussions are happening and how to make them better so that you can communicate more clearly and effectively. So here's some of the things I want to talk about with regards to semantics. These are the different things. Boxes metaphor is a metaphor I encountered that helped me understand how we communicate. Humpty Dumpty, how that relates. Disputed words, same but different. These are the things I'm going to talk about, so let's dive in. First is a boxes metaphor. This came from a book called The Metaphors We Live By. I encountered this and I thought, wow, that really opened my eyes. And it might help you better understand how difficult communication can be. In this metaphor, you imagine that every word is a box. So there's the definition box. And what's inside the box? The definition of that word. This word happens to be definition, but inside the box, what's contained in there is the definition of the word. You look it up in the dictionary, the definition, you put it in the box. So if you open this box, out spill more word boxes, because of course definitions are made up of words, which themselves are boxes. So as I said, a definition of definition is a statement of the exact meaning of a word. I've taken out the articles and other things to simplify this. So these are word boxes. Of course, I can open up any one of these and find more word boxes. What is the meaning of word? What's the definition of word? It's a symbol, distinct, meaningful element of speech. That's one definition. And I can open up that. What does meaningful mean? It means having meaning. And you can see how this can go on infinitely. Infinitely. You never run out of word boxes because every word has a definition, which itself has words, which have boxes, and it just goes on forever. And sometimes they start to be recursive. The word meaning already appeared earlier in my tree, my box tree. So sometimes it starts to recurse and go backwards. But why this is so devious is if I say the word definition in a sentence, and I have all these boxes within boxes within boxes, and that's what definition the word means to me. If you have different boxes inside your word definition box, then maybe we're miscommunicating. Unless I stop the conversation for every single word and say, okay, here's what I mean by the word definition, and I define it. And here's what I mean by all those words, and I define it. Now, what do you mean? And they define it. I go, wait, your definition's different than mine. I'm glad we clarified that so we're not miscommunicating. That would take forever, and nobody does that. Instead, we say sentences like I'm saying right now, and I hope that all the words that I'm saying that I'm using in such a way that your word boxes have sufficiently the same contents. So you can imagine how devious this can be. Miscommunication is so easy to happen if you think about the infinite boxes contained inside every single word that we say. It's almost miraculous to me that sometimes we can communicate with anyone else ever. So many different things can go wrong. Now, if you do this further, I don't expect you to read that, but I like to take a word or a sentence and start to do what I call a dictionary dissection. And I look up each word in the definition. And from that, I look up each word in that definition and each word in that. And at some point, it starts to recurse, and I think I've reached a deep enough level, and that's one word in the definition. Then I go back and do it again, and I go back and do it again. If I'm really trying to understand what exactly does this word mean, I might do this process. And it's a very long process, but by the end of it, I really have a deep understanding of what this word means by going through all those different boxes and going deeper and deeper. And then I might use a different dictionary and try a different source because it might be different. So this is a process that sometimes if I say, I'm not good enough just looking up in one dictionary, I really want to understand deeply what this word might mean. Sometimes I go through this process and it gives me a very deep understanding. But again, as you can see from just one simple word, if I'm talking to you and I say cow or table or regression testing or I say bug, my word bug, I sure hope it means the same as your word bug and all the boxes within, because if not, when I say bug, it might not mean the same thing when you say bug. And if we don't clarify that, we might be miscommunicating. Okay, any questions so far? My room proctor here is going to wave his hand if there's any questions come in through the Discord channel. All right, Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty is, of course, a character created from Lewis Carroll, and there's a particular segment in one of the books, Through the Looking Glass, 1871, that people that are interested in semantics and linguistics are very, they love this particular section. So I'm going to read it for you here. Humpty is sitting on a wall, and he's talking with Alice, one of the main characters, and they're talking about unbirthdays. Unbirthdays are every day of the year that's not your birthday. So 360, those are the days that aren't your birthday. And Humpty says, and there's only one day for birthday presents, you know. There's glory for you. Alice replied, "But I don't know what you mean by glory." Humpty smiled contemptuously. "Of course you don't, until I tell you. I meant there's a nice knockdown argument for you." Alice objected, "But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument." Humpty replied in a rather scornful tone, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, nothing more, nothing less." Now that doesn't seem quite fair. He used the word glory in such a non-standard way that it didn't make any sense to Alice in the context of their discussion. So some people might have just let it go by and said, "Oh, I wonder what he means by glory, whatever, we'll continue the discussion." But Alice stopped and said, "Hang on a second, I want to get some clarification. You've used a word in such a way that it doesn't make sense in the context. I need to get clarification." And so they started a semantic discussion. Lewis Carroll, again, in a different book, Symbolic Logic, says, "I maintain that a writer of any book is fully authorized in attaching any meaning they like to any word they intend to use. If I find the author saying at the beginning of their book, 'Let it be understood that by the word white, I always mean black, and by the word black, I always mean white,' then I must, as however injudicious I may think it, I must accept that author's decree." Now, what he means is for the context of that book, every time I'm reading the word white, oh, wait, the author means black. And every time I read the word black, I have to remember the author said white in the context of that book. As soon as I put the book down, then I know that those words probably don't mean the opposite, so I'm talking to you or talking to someone else. They go back to the standard meaning. But for the context of that conversation, that author has said, this is what I choose glory to mean. A nice knockdown argument. So, what is going on here? Why is this such an interesting segment of this book for semanticists? Because communication involves an unwritten, unspoken contract between the players, the people communicating, that the words that they use mean roughly what they're supposed to mean. If my word box called glory and all the definitions packed inside it means something slightly different than your word box named glory and all the stuff inside of it, maybe they're sufficiently close enough that it's not going to cause a problem, where there won't be any miscommunication. But if I use it in such a way that the word doesn't mean roughly what it's supposed to mean, and you don't stop like Alice did to clarify, we might be miscommunicating. This happens all the time in the workplace. We're in meetings, and people use a word, and you're too afraid to ask or raise your hand and say, "What do you mean by that?" So you stay quiet, and you make assumptions, and from assumptions, bad things happen, miscommunication. So this is very, very important aspect of semantics, is stopping when you don't understand. Now, that's very difficult. My number one tip for communication and becoming a better communicator is ask. But there's all sorts of social norms and different things that make people, generally speaking, afraid to ask. But it's my number one tip. If you want to seek deep understanding, ask. Or ask the other person, do you understand what I mean? That's how you get understanding, just like Alice did. So, this is my favorite quote about communication. It comes from William H. White. "The greatest enemy of communication is the illusion that it has taken place." You think about yourself in a meeting, and after an hour, everybody closes their notebooks, and they pat themselves in the back and say, "Great meeting, everybody," and they go off to their different cubicles. But in fact, they thought they were communicating, and nobody played the role of Alice to stop and say, "What do we mean by that? Are our word boxes sufficiently matched? Are the contents?" If that doesn't happen, it was just an illusion of communication, and that is the greatest enemy. You don't even realize it happened, and everyone goes back to their office, and you're working in different directions because there was no cohesion. Just for fun, this is XKCD, one of my favorite internet cartoons. Randall Munroe, this is his take on that. Humpty again says, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." This time Alice plays a game. She says, "Oh, I wonder what all those words mean. You just said meant. Maybe you're telling me that I can have all your stuff?" And he says, "What? No." And she says, "Oh, your car too? Thanks." So she's playing the game. "Humpty, you want to play the game about using words in non-standard ways? I can play it too." So that's his fun take on it, and I enjoyed that. So what's going on here? Alice raised her hand and she said, "Hold on a second. I dispute how you use that word glory. I want clarification." So let's talk about disputed words. There's many, many disputed words. If you look up on Wikipedia, disputed words, there's many, many dozens, even hundreds of these disputed words. So I'm going to go over a couple to kind of drive this point home. Fewer and less. Do those mean the same thing? They're often used as synonyms, oftentimes at a grocery store. 10 items are fewer, and you go to a different grocery store, and it's 10 items or less. And people understand them, generally speaking, to mean the same thing. But there is a nuance. Fewer, people have less patience for discussing semantics. Fewer is for things that you can practically count. You can count them on your finger. Less is for something that you cannot practically count. It's easy to count people. It's very difficult to count patience. It's too vague and ambiguous. It's too abstract. So that's the nuance. However, I'm not the type of person that's going to call out if somebody says, I have fewer patients for you. I'm saying, well, wait a second. You can't count patients, man. It's supposed to be fewer is only for things you can count, because that's not helping the conversation. I generally understand that they're losing patience with me. They're still communicating. My word box of less and fewer are similar enough to their word box of less and fewer. Even though there's differences, it's sufficient for effective communication. So I'm not going to stop someone and be that grammar Nazi or word corrector all the time. As long as I think that communication is happening effectively, efficiently, sufficiently, then I'm okay with it. But still, I might choose to dispute it if it happens in a conversation where I think that the distinction is very important. Here's another word, anticipate and expect. Generally, people use those in the similar ways as synonyms. But actually, anticipate is when you expect something to happen, and so you do an action. To expect is when you anticipate something because of something that happened. So she anticipated a difficult test, and so then she studied hard. As compared to she expected a high grade. Why? Because she studied hard. So there is a nuanced difference. But again, if somebody uses anticipate when they should have said expect, I probably will still understand what they mean. How about literally, ironically, resources? Literally, there's a new definition, not that old, that was added to many, many different dictionaries, Oxford English, Merriam-Webster, where the actual definition of literally now says, let me get this because it's amazing. Literally, a new definition added to many dictionaries now says, words that are so disputed that they have effectively changed and evolved. The new definition for literally is used for emphasis or to express strong feelings while not actually being true. Oh, that's great. How ironic. What a great segue. Yeah, Alanis Morissette kind of brought this ironic to highlight in her song. Isn't it ironic? Everybody say, no, that's coincidental or it's unfortunate. These are not ironic things. But we all understood the song which she was talking about. And finally, resources. A lot of people get very bent out of shape if you are called a resource. Now, one of the definitions for resource says something that's called upon in a time of need. I am okay with that. If somebody says you're a resource, and they mean it in that way, I'm like, yeah, you're calling on me in a time of need. I like to think that I can help you. Now, of course, words can be used as weapons, and sometimes they use it in a different way, in a weaponized way, to mean that I'm something disposable, something easily replaceable. And if they mean that, if I was to open up their word box and say, what do you mean by resource? They say, well, you know, there's another person around the corner I can hire. I say, well, then don't call me resource. I disagree with the way that you're using that word. But there's many, many words that we often come across that we might dispute and play the Alice role. Done, finished, complete. Anybody ever gone through this exercise in your place of work and gone through the definition of done? I see some hands, great. So I have a great, there's of course, the definition of done, there's dictionary definitions, but there's also contextual definitions, just like the author that wrote a book and said black, white, white, black. You can come up with a definition of done that doesn't match a dictionary, but it matches you and your team at your workplace. And as long as you all have consensus, you will be able to communicate effectively. I was at a company, I was onboarding, and going through all the different onboarding processes, and they had a wonderful glossary of all the different terminology and words that they used at this workplace. And I came across the word done and their company definition of what do they mean when they say the word done. And I was really impressed that they had this glossary and all this stuff, so I'd be able to speak their language. And they had a definition of done. Great. Well, right underneath it, they had another term called done-done. Anybody have that? Yeah, done-done. And that was a different definition. I was like, oh, that's cool. So when they say done to each other, and the castle walls here, within these castle walls, they understand it to mean this. When they say done, done, it means something else. Below that, done, done, done. Yes, they had a third term called done, done, done. I thought, this is so dumb. But upon retrospect and thinking about it, I was like, wait, this actually makes a lot of sense. Because done, done, done had a third different definition. Maybe they could have used different words like finished or complete, but it didn't matter. In the context of that company, within those castle walls, if somebody asked me, Damian, well, how's your progress? And I said, it's done, done, but it's not done, done, done. We were communicating. There was no vagueness, no ambiguity. They completely understood how the progress was. So I was like, this is brilliant. Here's one more I wanted to just focus on for a moment, best practice. In the testing world, there's sometimes some conversation and debate about what best practices are, do they even exist? There can't be a best. Oh, some people say, well, it's just a phrase. Well, this is my daughter, Alina, and we were out on a daddy-daughter date one time. We were driving around. She says, Daddy, Stella's my best friend, and Avery's my best friend. Well, you can only be one best, just like there can only be one unique. So I laughed and said, you're stupid. No. I said, sweetheart, what do you mean, a semantic conversation? And she said, well, Daddy, what I mean is Stella's my really good friend, and Avery is my really good friend. So her word box for best had different contents than mine. Mine, there can only be one best. Hers just meant it's a synonym for something that's really good. Now, once I understood what she meant, now I understand that when she says best, she might mean just something that's really, really good to her. So it was a semantic discussion that allowed me to better communicate with my daughter. So let's look at best practice more. A definition for best, that's what's the most excellent, outstanding, or desirable. Best practice is two words put together, so the word definition of practice, the actual application or use of an idea, a belief, or method. You smash them together and you just get the most excellent, outstanding, desirable application of an idea, belief, or method. But sometimes just taking two discrete definitions and putting them together isn't the understood definition. So if you look up best practice in a dictionary, it has something slightly different. A procedure that is accepted or prescribed as being correct or the most effective. If you look up best practice in different sources, different dictionaries, you'll probably come across a definition that's something like this. So I have to wonder, is there such a thing? Contexts are varied. My context might be different than yours, so is it possible to say that your best practice is correct and most effective in my context, which is very different? That might not be. However, as a semanticist, I also understand that best practice could mean really good. Best, the word best, you might say this is the best bowl of soup, and I understand that you don't mean that you've tried every soup. You just mean subjectively, you're using that as emphasis, as hyperbole to say, I really love this soup. You might mean best, like the world's great boss. You might use it to emphasize and say something to your boss. I really appreciate you're the world's best boss. I haven't worked for everyone. Or you might mean it in some context. Somebody wins a race and they get first place. It might be reasonable to say they were the best runner in this particular race on this particular day, at this particular time, in this particular place. They were the best runner. And in that context, there's no arguing. Yes, they were the best, most effective runner in that particular race. So if somebody says, Damian, I got to tell you about this best testing practice I have. I say, wait a second. Do you just mean best like soup, like you really, really like it a lot? Or best like you're using it to emphasis? Or do you mean best in your particular race? I mean context. At your company, it's the best possible practice. And if they say that, I say, well, let's compare context then. If yours is similar enough to mine, then it might also be a best practice in my context as well. This is from Napoleon Dynamite. It's just a quick scene I love. If you've ever seen the movie, this is the lead character, Napoleon, and he's on the couch with his brother Kip, and they're watching these lame videos of their uncle throw a football. And Napoleon says, this is pretty much the worst video ever made. And his brother Kip says, Napoleon, like anyone can even know that. I love that because his brother Kip is taking it very literal. As in, first of all, it's just subjective. What's the best and worst video? And also, you'd have to see every video ever made in order to make that distinction. So I love this little clip. It always reminds me of semantics when I see it. Disputed words, these are all sorts of different disputed words. Remember that words evolve, they change. Is communication still happening, or are they using it in such a non-standard way that it might make sense to raise your hand like Alice and dispute their meaning of the word glory so that you don't miscommunicate? So, same but different. Same but different. This is a fun way of saying something that's more formally called distinction without a difference. It's an artificially created distinction where no real or meaningful distinction exists. Okay, so what does that mean? I'll give you an example from the movie Crocodile Dundee back in '86. In the movie, Crocodile Dundee is the hero, and he's walking down the street with his partner, and they come across a mugger, and the mugger brandishes a knife and says, give me your money. And Crocodile Dundee pulls out a knife, and he says, a much bigger knife. He says, that's not a knife. He points to the other guy. He says, that's a knife, and his really big Bowie knife. So, what's happening here? Is it possible that the writers of this movie were trying to make the hero of the movie, Crocodile Dundee, seem like a complete moron or blind or something? Like he can't see that the guy's holding a knife, and he says, that's not a knife. It's clearly a knife. So what's going on here? That is a distinction without a difference. He's making a distinction, even though there's no real difference. They're both knives, but he's making a distinction. So the next question is to ask, why is he making that distinction? If there's no real difference, then what is the purpose of the distinction? So you can think about a cop pulls you over. Have you been drinking alcohol? And you say, no, just beer. All right, sir, can you please step out of the car? You say, hey, that's no car, that's a Ferrari. He says, all right, sir, I think you're lying to me. I say, no, those are alternative facts. These are distinctions without a real difference. So the purpose, the thing you have to ask is, why am I making that distinction? I might be making the distinction between car and Ferrari to try and raise my status, try and seem bigger or richer than I am. And that's another thing that can happen. If somebody's talking about bugs and they say, no, that's not a bug, it's a feature. ask why. Maybe they're trying to advance some political agenda. Maybe they're trying to make a commentary. Maybe they're trying to raise their status while simultaneously lowering the status of another, just like Crocodile Dundee was trying to do with that mugger. So if you are talking to somebody and you say a word and fewer, and they say, no, it's less, and you say, well, okay, in this context, I understand the nuance, but they mean basically saying, no, you got to say fewer. You have to say fewer. You can't say less. I'd be like, seems like they're making a distinction without any real difference here. So why? What's going on here? It might behoove you to dig a little deeper and find out. Then you can find out, oh, the reason they're making that distinction, that's important. And you get to a much deeper level of understanding. Life of a word. Words are living. Did you know that? Words are born, they live, sometimes they die. When a word is born, it's called a neologism. Again, comes from Greek. Neo is new, logos is a Greek word for word, so new word. It's a newly coined word or expression. They have different phases where they go protologism and prelogism, where they're entering the common language. Sometimes they haven't entered yet. Sometimes they're entering. Sometimes they're now accepted, and it's no longer a neo or protologism. They're just called a word with a definition. But it's important to understand that these words are born, they change meaning, and they die. So I'll go over some examples. Unbirthday, I talked about that. Lewis Carroll brought that brand new word into existence in his book, Through the Looking Glass, in 1817. And before that, the word didn't exist. But now, if you've read the book, you understand it's every day that's not your birthday. Noob. That's a brand new word, just about 20 or 30 years old. It means somebody that's relatively new to technology or new to the internet. Truthiness, Stephen Colbert popularized that word. It means something that has the feeling of truth. Neuroplasticity, the ability of your brain to adapt and form new connections and synapses are melding and changing all the time. A very, very new word, even in the world of medicine. So words are born all the time. Brand new words come into existence. Sometimes they're repurposed. Google, of course, we know it as a search engine or a company, but before that it existed and meant something completely different. Spam used to be meat, now it's an unwanted email. Sometimes words take on new meaning. Cloud, it's no longer a thing in the sky. It still is, but it's also someone else's computer somewhere else. Ask. Has anyone ever said, I got a big ask? You ever heard that? Oh, that bugs me. But also, would you believe that ask as a noun dates back over 100 years? People were using ask as a noun for a long time. The addition of the modifier big ask is only about 20 years old. So people used to say, I have an ask as a noun. But the addition of the word big in front is only about 20. I got a big ask. It's not just an ask, it's a big ask. So words sometimes take on new meaning. They're evolving. Sometimes words can evolve so much that they become the opposite of what they used to mean. Bully used to be a stand-up person, somebody you really admire. Now it means somebody you want to avoid, somebody that's not so admirable. Awesome used to mean something that's terrifying and awful. Now it means the opposite. Awful used to mean something that's awe-inspiring and wonderful. Now it means something that's bad. Sometimes words evolve and change meaning so much that they take on a completely opposite meaning. Finally, sometimes words are smashed together. Brunch is breakfast and lunch put together, and just like I took best in practice, you can put the definitions together and sometimes come to a meaning, or sometimes that word has a completely different meaning. Spork, it's a spoon and a fork. Dun, 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 I already told that story. And sometimes words die. Fudgel is, let me see what fudgel, I always forget this definition. I can't find my cursor. Who cares? Fudgel, look it up. It's a fantastic word that doesn't exist anymore. Brabble is to argue about something that is meaningless. It's just a meaningless argument. Apricity is the feeling of the warm sun on a spring day. I love these words, but nobody uses them anymore. If you look up an Oxford English dictionary that has the origin, the usage, and the evolution of words, it'll also have whether the word is obsolete. These are now listed as obsolete words in the Oxford English Dictionary. So words live. They evolve. They can die. So again, if you're using a word and somebody disputes it, you might say, well, I'm using the new version of spam, not the old version of spam. Get with the times. It's no longer a neologism. It's entered the public discourse. Everybody's using it in this new way. You might come to some understanding. Strange creatures. I'll go through this quickly. Tardigrade. It's also called a water bear or a moss piglet. It's one of my favorite animals or favorite creatures in this world. Here's another creature. It's a species of very large saltwater clam. It's a mollusk. It's native to the west coast of North America. And you can read the rest of that, but there's a lot of information, even some pictures of this particular creature. Now, I would ask you, now that I've introduced you to two different creatures, which do you feel you know more about? I guess most of you might say that the second creature you know more about. I've given you all types of description about it. You've seen pictures of it. However, maybe you don't know the name of this creature. And I'd say, wow, how can you say you know a lot about this creature? Even though you don't know the name, you don't know what it's called, that seems ridiculous. And the first one, I didn't just give you one name, I gave you 3 names. how can you say that you know more about the second creature? So this comes from Feynman. He's a physicist. He says it's the difference between knowing a thing, knowing about a thing, and knowing the name of a thing. Sometimes you might know all about a particular thing but not know what it's called. And that's more valuable in his opinion than just knowing the name of the thing but having a shallow understanding of it. He talks about a story when he was in grade school, and he pointed at a bird on the playground. And he said, oh, I know, his friend said, oh, that's called a this and a this and a this, and he listed off all the Latin and scientific names. But he didn't know much about it. And Feynman said, well, I know that it migrates at this time of year, and I know where how it lays its eggs and how it mates. And he knew all about it, even though he didn't know all these different scientific names. And he argued that he had more knowledge about this. So that's very important. Sometimes when you're talking with somebody in a workplace, it can be important to distinguish whether they know the name and not much about it, or whether you understand more about it but not the name. Now, here's a quick story about that. I was at a company, and I asked, I was in a test lead position, and I asked, we got a new build. A new build was shoved over to us in the test environment. And I asked one of the people working for me, I said, all right, I need you to go run some smoke tests. I sometimes call them sanity tests. Generally speaking, those are what they mean is all the tests that we have to run. Oh, I'm sorry, I asked them to run regression tests. All the tests that we have to run them against this new build. And the person came back very quickly, and they said, we're done. I said, wow, that was fast. You must be an incredibly fast tester. And then we pushed to production, and all kinds of bugs were exposed. And I went, well, that doesn't make any sense. This is stuff that should have been caught during regression testing. And then that process happened again. A new build, I asked them to do regression. They came back quickly, and they said they're done. And then again, bugs popped up. And I said, what's going on? So the third time we got the build, I said, I want you to go do regression testing. But first, Alice, I said, what is regression testing? And they said, oh, your regression testing. We have thousands of tests, and I just take a few of the most important ones, and I run those. I said, oh, that's what I consider to be called smoke or sanity testing. I spoiled the ending before. That's what I call smoke or sanity testing. And they said, oh, that's what I call regression testing. I went, oh my gosh, we've been miscommunicating this entire time. I was asking you to run the entire suite of tests, and you were just running a handful of tests, which is why these bugs were escaping. So it wasn't about their testing ability, it was about a miscommunication. Bad things happened because it was the illusion of communication. Because they and I both had words, but the meaning behind it was different. I knew a word, they knew a word, but they didn't have the understanding. I had the understanding, but was using a different word. So I won't leave you in suspense. A tardigrade, if you're unfamiliar, it's this fascinating creature, an extremophile. It lives in all sorts of different environments, and it's very hard to kill. It's really cool. And the other creature, here's the name of it. Anybody want to wager pronouncing that? Yell it out. Oh, I heard somebody in the front say it correct. A lot of people say geoduck, which is exactly how it looks. However, it is pronounced geoduck. It comes from the Nisqually tribe, the Lushoshit language of a Native American tribe, and is pronounced geoduck from their language. It doesn't look like it's spelled, but neither is kernel or February. There's all sorts of words that don't exactly sound or pronounced like they are said. So that's another thing about communication. Sometimes it can be miscommunicated if you're saying the wrong thing. I say, hey, do you know what a geoduck is? And the other person says, I know what a geoduck is, but not a geoduck. I have no idea. All right, the name is not the thing. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. That's Romeo and Juliet, of course. Is it true, though? Is it true? Could you call a rose any other name, and would it still smell as sweet? What if instead of a rose, you called it a stink blossom? Or what if, let's go further, what if you called it a phlegm flower? I got you a bouquet of phlegm flowers. Oh, no thanks. Well, of course, the name of the thing doesn't change the attributes, the chemical properties that makes it actually fragrant. It doesn't change it. However, words can change our perception of the thing. So even though a rose might still smell as sweet, it might change my perception of that thing because of how I name it. This is going to come up again later on when we talk about testers and the way that we refer to problems. Here's another reference to that. Si ce n'est pas un pipe, this is from René Magritte, 1929. That basically in French says, this is not a pipe. Which is true, that's not a pipe. It's a drawing of a pipe. It's a drawing of a pipe that's presented up on a screen. That's not a pipe at all, it's just a representation. Here's my version of it. None of these are taxis. One is a photo of a taxi, one's a model of a taxi, one's a drawing, one's just a description of a taxi. None of these things are taxis. This is important. Different ways of saying this is the map is not the territory. The menu is not the meal. The test plan or the test strategy is not the plan for testing or the strategy for testing. Sometimes people get caught up in the document rather than the plan. They get caught up in, oh, the test plan, you left out this section. Is the plan sufficient for planning out your strategy for testing? So remember that the thing is not the name is not the thing. In summary, Box's metaphors help me better understand just how difficult communication can be, how deep it is. Humpty Dumpty helps you understand when words can be disputed, which goes into the disputed words. Is communication still happening sufficiently? Same but different. Sometimes there's a distinction without a difference. The life of a word, they born, they live, they die. Strange creatures, the name is not the thing. These will all help us as we enter the second part, which is phrase deconstruction and analysis, using these semantic ideas as we deconstruct this phrase. Testers do or don't help prevent or detect problems. I've heard many variations of this exact phrase throughout my entire career, and it always is accompanied with some debate, some discussion. I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to start at the back and work forwards. So first, we're going to look at the word problem. A matter or situation regarded as unwelcome or harmful, needed to be dealt with and overcome. That's one definition. Another definition comes from the late Jerry Weinberg. He says that a problem is a difference between things as desired and things as perceived. I like that because it really shows how problems without the feeling of emotion is not a problem at all. It's a difference between an emotional feeling, a desire, and how you perceive something. That's very important. I have another talk that digs much, much deeper into the idea of problems. Bugs, if you're in technology and testing and development and technology in any way, you probably call problems bugs. An error in a computer system or a program or system. Brett Petticourt, a tester out there, he says it's anything that bugs someone. It's pithy and to the point. If it bothers you, if you have an emotional response to it, that's a bug. Somebody says, I really like this product, and I say, I don't because I don't like the color of it. I don't like the shape of it. It's a bug to me. It might not be to you. It's very subjective. But does it matter if we call them defects or bugs? Here's other things that we call problems in technology. Defects, issues, failures, glitch, error, all sorts of slip-ups, blunders, oversights, hiccups. Remember I talked about words can change our perception, our feeling of the thing. The rose, if you call it a stink blossom, it might change your perception. What if I'm testing something and I find something wrong, a problem, and I go to the developer and I come over and I say, hey, I found a gaffe in your code. They might have a different reaction instead if I come to them and say, hey, I found a flaw or an issue with your code. Because we perceive words in different ways and it can affect our feelings. Sometimes there's also legal ramifications. A company might write up a contract that says, we agree to deliver this software to the client with no more than 5 defects. And we deliver it, and the client looks and they say, this thing stinks, there's 27 defects. And we come back and say, there's 5 defects, the rest of them are issues or glitches. So sometimes there's legal ramifications to the way that you name problems. Not only it affects how you feel, but it could also affect legal ramifications. Let's continue. Relativism. It's the doctrine that knowledge, truth, and morality exist in relation to culture, society, context. They're not absolute. Michael Bolton, a famous tester for rapid software testing, he called it he derived the relative rule. He said, for any abstract X, X is only X to some person at some time. And I've taken that and I rephrased it. The relative rule describes the relationship between someone, that's the who, something, that's the what, and at some time, that's the when. So I'll describe this further and talk about how it relates to problems. I'll use it as an example. So here's a teddy bear. Very cute little teddy bear. But it's not just any teddy bear. This is baby Sarah's teddy bear. And how does baby Sarah feel about this teddy bear? Well, of course, she loves the teddy bear. It's her teddy bear. It's Mr. Snuggles. She loves it. But this is baby Sarah's friend, baby Jane. How does baby Jane feel about that teddy bear? It's not baby Jane's teddy bear. To her, it's just another bear, so she's rather indifferent to it. This shows that if you change the who, it can change the relationship, the feeling towards that object, towards the bear. Let's continue. This is a blanket. It's not just any blanket. This is baby Jane's blanket. It's Mr. Cozy. And she loves this blanket. But then how does baby Sarah feel about it? She's indifferent to it. It's not her blanket. It's just another blanket. This shows how if you change the what, the item, that it could change the relationship to how you feel about it. Finally, baby Jane's all grown up. Here's adult Jane. How does she feel about the bear and the blanket? Well, she still likes the bear, but she doesn't love it like she did as a child. She still has some fondness. And it's about the same as she has for this random blanket that was her friend's blanket. She's rather indifferent to both of them as an adult. This shows how you should change time. It could change the effect, how you feel about something. Now, we're not here to talk about teddy bears and blankets. We're here to talk about bugs. So let's replace this with a bug. This is a bug that when you go to a website, you pick your product, you put it in your cart, and you put in all your credit card information, all your address information, and you click buy it. And instead of buying it, the website crashes. Okay? How does baby Sarah feel about it? She's not using that website. She didn't care. How's baby Jane feel about it? Same thing. She's not on that website trying to buy stuff. But adult Jane, she's trying to buy something. It makes her angry. So this is how people, our customers, might relate to a bug, a problem, a glitch, an error, a fault. This shows how the relativeness and subjectivity to problems matter. So what we call problems, the words that we use to call problems, might matter. It might affect how we feel about them. It might have legal ramifications. Also, remember that problems are relative. They're subjective, depending on what and when. All right, next, let's talk about preventing and detecting. Preventing is keeping something from happening or arising. Detecting is similar. It's discovering or identifying the presence or existence of. So this one is preventing it, stopping it. This one is just realizing it, recognizing it. So I looked up some headlines. I just went to Google News and I typed in the word prevent and I looked at different headlines that, detect, and I looked at different headlines that had the word detect, and here's some I found. Can AI detect fake news? That was one headline, and there was an article with it. Locusts can detect cancer in humans. Another, new video technology will help Minnesota police detect suspects. So I read these headlines, and sometimes I dig into the articles, but just the headline alone, here's how it made me feel. Okay. You know, locusts can detect cancer in humans. Okay, but the person already has cancer, so the locust is detected. Wouldn't it be great if you could figure out before they get cancer? I mean, okay, that's great and all. Minnesota, the new technology will help them detect suspects. Okay, that's not preventing the crime. So I also looked up the same thing, and I looked up the word prevent in news headlines. Installation of technology to prevent rail crashes nears completion. These firefighters prevented a fire from spreading to a hospital. The Mayo Clinic finds a trick to prevent kidney stones. When I read these headlines, here's how I felt. Hey, great. Not only, they didn't just detect the fire and say, hey, guess what, a hospital burnt down. We detected it. They were able to prevent that fire from spreading to the hospital. So it made me feel a little bit differently than when I read the word detect. So remember, words can affect our perceptions. Words can affect our feeling. The word prevent gives me a different feeling than the word detect. All right, let's move on. Causality, this is a pretty big topic. The relationship between cause and effect. How can this possibly be related to problems? Well, let's take our little story. There's our bug. You remember you try to buy something, and instead of buying it, the website crashes. And we already know that one effect of this cause is an angry Jane, an angry adult Jane. We've already talked about that. But cause and effect is always a many-to-many relationship. So what's another thing that happens because of this bug? Another is the company that doesn't get any money. Instead of Jane giving money to the company doesn't get that money because the website crashed. So that's another example of an effect from this cause. But you can also go the other way in a causality chain. You can go backwards in time and say, well, what was the reason for this website crash? Well, if you go backwards, you can find out it was an extra semicolon in the code. There was an extra semicolon in there. That extra semicolon caused the website. It compiled fine. They were able to push it out to customers. But at the point where somebody clicks the button, the website crashes, causing Jane to be angry and causing the company to lose money. But where did that semicolon come from? Go backwards in time. There's developer Joe, and he's usually really, really good, but he was super tired that day, and he accidentally hit an extra semicolon. That caused the semicolon to crash the website in production, and angry Jane and the company loses money. Go backwards. Why is Joe so tired? Well, the dog was up, his neighbor's dog was up barking all night, and Joe couldn't get any sleep, so he came into work way too tired, and he hit an extra semicolon, and on down the line. Why was that dog barking all night? Well, first of all, it was really cold. The dog was outside, and it was really cold. The dog was uncomfortable. But also, this is a super simplified example, but many relationship, the dog also didn't have a house. It couldn't get warm. So because there was no dog house and the dog is outside, it's up barking all night, making Joe so tired that he accidentally hits an extra semicolon. It compiles fine, but it's pushed to production, causing the website to crash, making Jane angry, and the company doesn't get money. So that's my little causality chain. Now you can traverse this chain and put your eyeball at different places, and where you put your eyeball matters. Let's put our eyeball here first, okay? I can detect that as a tester. I can look at this in staging or testing, and I'm testing along, and I type in all my credit card information, and I click purchase, and it blows up, and I say, hey, I have detected a bug. I've detected a bug. I could also then reasonably say, if a developer then pulls out the code, they fix the semicolon, they check it back in, it's fixed, they push it out to production, it might be reasonable to also say, I have potentially prevented Jane from being angry. I have potentially prevented the company from losing money. This is the same problem in many different forms. So by detecting a website crash, I have also prevented these other two problems. Let's move our point of view over here. What if I'm sitting in a code review? Sitting in the code review, and I look down through and I say, hey, I just noticed there's an extra semicolon on this line. And they say, oh my gosh, Damian, good find. And they pull out the code, they delete that semicolon, they check it back in. It might also be reasonable to say, I detected that. I saw and I detected that problem, that bug in the code, which also prevented the website from crashing, which also prevented Jane from being angry, which also prevented the company from losing money. It might be reasonable to say those things. You can move your eye to any point in the thing. Maybe I climb over the fence and I see that this dog is barking and I say, hey, this dog is barking. And I go to the neighbors, I say, muzzle your dog. And so they put a muzzle on it. Therefore, Joe is no longer tired. I've prevented Joe from being tired and Joe doesn't make the semicolon mistake. And I've prevented all these other problems. I think those are probably reasonable things to say in a causality chain. So is it reasonable to say that I only prevented or did I only detect things or did I also prevent these things as well? I think it might be reasonable if you talk about it from a causality point of view. You know what Jane was trying to buy, of course? A doghouse. She caused her own bug in some kind of weird temporal shift. I don't know. So she caused her own bug. All right. So what? Potential effects of word choice, whether you say prevent or detect, can make someone feel differently, just in the news headlines I said. And consider the causality in your perspective. Where you put your eye on the causality chain could mean different things. It might be reasonable to say by detecting something, you also prevented other things. Help. Makes it easier for someone to do something, improves the situation. That's a dictionary definition. What does help mean in the context of this? It's a very, very small word, but important in the larger context of the meaning of this different phrase. Testers do or don't help prevent or detect problems. Let's say I put my eyeball here, and I'm testing along, and I click purchase, and the website blows up. It might be reasonable to say, I have detected this all by myself. Nobody else helped me do this. I did it all by myself. But in order to prevent Jane from being angry and the company from losing money, it's not enough to just detect it. It has to be fixed. But I don't know how to code. So I got to have to enter a bug. Developer has to pull out the code. They have to make the change. They have to check the code back in. Then they push it out to production. And now the website doesn't crash. Jane's no longer angry and the company doesn't lose money. So it might be reasonable to say, I detected this by myself and I helped prevent those other problems. I didn't prevent those problems by myself. It also took a developer to help me prevent those problems. And as I move my eye around, depending on my skill set, depending on my abilities and permissions, maybe I'm looking through the code at the code review, I see an extra semicolon, but I do know how to code, and at this company, I have permission to pull code. So I pull it myself, I delete that semicolon, I push the code back out. Now the website's not crashing, Jane's not angry, the company isn't losing money. Not only did I detect it by myself, but nobody helped me prevent it either. I potentially prevented these problems all by myself. Don't need the word help in the sentence. I have prevented and detected a problem. All right, and you can move that around different places. So what? The inclusion or exclusion of the word help might change the meaning of the phrase drastically, whether you did it all by yourself or with some assistance. Consider the specific problem, and if detection or prevention of the problem can be done all by yourself, or if you need someone else to assist you, to help. Do or don't, these are helping verbs, verbs that help the main verb in a sentence by extending its meaning. They convey complicated shades of meaning. These are what helping verbs are. There's a special type of helping verb called auxiliary verbs. It's used in forming the tenses, moods, voices of other verbs in the sentence. Here's a couple auxiliary verbs. Do and don't, that's present tense. Did and didn't, that's past tense. So someone might say testers do prevent problems, or testers didn't detect problems. Those are different ways of saying it. But there's also a special type of auxiliary verbs. Those are called modal verbs, auxiliary verbs that express necessity or possibility, and there's a whole bunch of those. Here's what they look like. Can or could. Those express the ability or possibility. Slightly different, may or might. That talks about permission or possibility that something could happen. Will or would. Those are often related to requesting or consequences of actions. Must, necessity or requirement. And the last one's a little different, shall and should, obligation, correctness, or suggestion. We'll talk about that one in just a moment. But you can see how all of these, replacing the word do or don't with any one of these, could drastically change the meaning of the phrase. Let's look at some. Testers do help prevent or detect problems. We've talked about that one. They didn't. That's in the past tense. They didn't help prevent problems. They weren't even here. They were on vacation. What about the next one? Testers can help detect problems. They can. They have the ability to. Whether they do or don't, I don't know, but they can. What about may? Testers may prevent problems. They have the permission at our company. They have the roles and responsibilities, the rights to check code in and out. They may. We allow it here. Testers will. It's a decree. Testers will. If you find a problem and you know how to code, then you will fix that problem. You will do it here. What about must? Testers must. Very similar to will. It's a decree, talking about necessity. The last one, testers should. Now we're talking about something a little different, talking about opinion. Testers should help prevent problems. This is a matter of opinion. So let's talk about that. Descriptive statements are one type of statement. They make an assertion based on empirical evidence, things like facts. In contrast to that, there's something called normative statements. They express a value judgment. These are opinions. For example, descriptive is an 11-letter word. It sure is. Normative is a better word. Well, that's just my opinion. So that shows the difference between descriptive and normative. All these other auxiliary verbs are descriptive, can, must, will, but should is a normative one. Testers should prevent bugs. Testers shouldn't detect bugs, or whatever you happen to be saying. That's a matter of opinion. So now, next time somebody says this phrase, or you hear the word should or shouldn't, now you know that they're making a normative statement. They're talking about opinions, and you can dig into it and find out, why do you say that? Why do you believe that to be true? So what? Identify the helping verb that's used or perhaps omitted or maybe even implied to better understand what the person is actually trying to say, what they actually mean, and consider if it's a statement of fact or if it's just a statement of opinion. That word should or shouldn't should now be a red flag. You should listen for that word and say, wait a second, now you're talking about normative stuff rather than descriptive stuff. Here we are, the last word, testers. All right, so before I define testers, I'd like to get into the definition of testing. Of course, I look at a lot of different dictionaries and a lot of different sources, and boy, have I dug into this word over the years. Hundreds of different definitions of testing. There's a few that really stuck out to me as good ones I really liked. This comes from the folks at Rapid Software Testing. They say it's the process of evaluating a product by learning about it through exploration, experimentation, and it includes to some degree questioning, studying, modeling, observation, inference. That talks about what testing is and how it's done, but it lacks a why. And sometimes I really like to see a why in my definition. It makes it more robust. So I found another definition from Kem Kaner. He's a professor of testing, believe it or not, down in Florida. There's a university that has testing classes. And he says it's an investigation conducted, that's the what, to provide stakeholders with information about the quality of the product or service under test. He includes a why. It's in order to provide information. And sometimes in the past, I would take those two definitions and smash them together because it made a more robust definition for me. I liked it because it not only talked about what and how, but also why. But over the years, I've come to an even more robust definition of testing. Strap yourselves in, all hands and legs inside the vehicle. Here it is. Here's my definition of testing after 25 years and reading hundreds of definitions. Testing is utilizing various tools and approaches. That's what testers do. We all use different sorts of tools and technology to help us do our job. And different approaches. Some people are in Agile or Fragile or Agile and V and different models and ways that we make, and different testing methodologies and approaches. And we use those in some combination at some degree. Depending on which company and which environment, what your company looks like, you might use this set of tools with this approach, and you go to a different company, they use some of the same tools but not as much, and they fully use and embrace this other methodology. Why? To help evaluate quality characteristics. Things like the size and the shape and the smell and the reliability and all the different ilities that come, the security, the archivability, the functionality, the performance, all these different quality characteristics. We're evaluating those things, the things that are valuable to the customer. How? By exploration, experimentation. Exploration, Vasco da Gama, he's out there not really knowing what he'll find. He's just exploring. He doesn't have expectations. That's sometimes how testers should approach a product. If you don't have requirements or your requirements are vague, you can explore and just poke around and use your gut and use your intuition and explore and find things that you think are good and things that you think are bad. That's a very valuable way of testing. Or experimentation. Sometimes you can act like a scientist. Scientists have hypotheses. They conduct experiments. Those experiments produce results, and the results are either in line or disprove that hypothesis. This is basically what testing is as an experimentation. You have requirements. Things that the product should be or do. You run an experiment called a test, and that test produces results. Are the results of that test in line with the requirement? Did they support the requirement or did they disprove it? So that's how testing is very much like an experiment. Why again? Often it's to pertinent, useful information. Sometimes I test to practice, to get better at my skill. Sometimes I test because it's fun. Many of us test for money. That's one reason that we test. But always, or very often, it's to get this information, useful, pertinent information. Do what with it? Provide it to relevant stakeholders. Give it to people that matter, that actually care about this information. Why? It enables them to make more informed, confident decisions. An informed, educated decision is always going to be better than an uninformed, uneducated decision. So they're taking, I'm at my time. I'm almost done anyway. And they take this may also indirectly lead to increased quality. So just because I'm testing by exploration and experimentation, I'm providing this pertinent information to stakeholders, and they are coming up with more educated decisions, their educated decision might be, we don't have the money to fix this, or we don't have the time. So my information may not lead to increased quality, but it might. That's why quality and testing itself does not necessarily lead to increased quality. So, what is a tester? It's one who performs testing. All those things I had on the previous slide, that's what tester is. Why is this important? Because testers do other things. Just like everyone, we're multitasking. Not only you're testing and you're exploring and experimenting, you're providing information, pertinent information to stakeholders and all these types of things, but sometimes you might be doing something else. What if I was able, I have the skills and I have the ability in my company to pull out code, delete semicolons, and push the code back in? There's nothing in this previous definition that talks about pulling code, editing code, and committing code. At that moment in time, I'm not acting as a tester. I'm acting as a developer or some other role. So it might be reasonable to say, as a tester, I detected this problem, but I was acting as a developer when I actually prevented the problem. Does that make sense? Depending on the definition of testing, maybe your company also has in their definition, testers can also pull out code, edit code, commit code. If that's part of your definition at your company, then when you are doing those things, it might be reasonable to say, as a tester, you are also preventing problems, because that's part of the definition of testing at your company. Okay, so the definition of testing might change the meaning of the phrase. Consider the actions performed to better understand the accuracy of the phrase. Are you exploring and experimenting, or are you checking out code? So testers detect defects, they don't prevent problems, they must help detect bugs, they should help prevent bugs, all these different variations of the phrase. Which ones are right, which ones are wrong? There's no answer until you dig in and have a semantic discussion with the person saying it to better understand what do they mean by that phrase. Here's the summary slide. Testers understand the definition of testing to better understand the role and responsibilities and the meaning of the phrase. Do or don't, those are those helping verbs. Consider if it's a state of fact or opinion. Help, that little inclusion or exclusion of the word can make a big difference. It might affect the complete meaning of the phrase. Prevent or detect, it can make you feel different ways. And consider where you are in the causality chain, whether you're preventing or detecting something. And problems by any other name, and remember that they're subjective as well. This is a tester friend of mine, Keith Klain. He tweeted out recently, what if we spent more time talking to each other about what words actually mean instead of being all wound up about what we think people meant by them? And I love that. I think it's a suitable finish to this topic. And just remember, words matter. So thank you very much for your time. I'll look for your questions on the Discord channel. Thanks.